Okay, good afternoon, good day to everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in to our latest NPM webinar. So I'm joined here with by Dr. Alexander Budzier. So welcome, Alex. So Dr. Budzier is the Fellow in Management Practice in Information Systems at Saïd Business School. He completed his PhD at the school and has worked with T-Mobile International and as a consultant with McKinsey. And Alex teaches on our MSc in Major Program Management, as well as the MPLA program, which is run in conjunction with the UK Civil Service. So welcome, Alex. We're just going to run through a presentation with Alex, which should provide an insight into the content of our MSc and major programs, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end of that as well. So welcome, Alex, and if you want to take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me. What I would like to let me try to move the first slides. There we go. And so thank you very much for having me here. And what I wanted to talk about is a little bit of the insights that we glean from our research, because in our teaching programs, what we're really trying to do is, from the perspective in the MSc, what we're bringing together is, on the one hand, classical and seminal readings and study and seminal knowledge, and combining that with the latest thinking. And as Tom just said, so I came from the practitioner industry, and when I joined Saïd Business School in 2009, I focused on a big research program on what we can learn across various different disciplines. So in particular, I was interested in what can we learn in IT from other people like civil engineering, other major programs around the world to deliver IT a little better. And so I brought with me today a couple of slides, and and then we're going to explain to you also a little bit about the background of the MSc afterwards, and before we open up everything for question and answers. So I titled this little insight into our research program and what we're teaching here, that I want to talk about the benefits and the risk of accelerating technology. And one of the key disruptive moments at the moment is that we're actually seeing, everybody's always talking about the world is moving faster and faster, and here's some snippets of evidence and why that actually might be true, not just a superstition. So one of the biggest trends everybody's talking about in the IT space in the moment is the Internet of Things, and sort of the real large-scale defragmentation of end-user devices and multi-channel technologies. And so about 1 trillion objects are supposed to be connected to the internet by 2025, and that's probably, as we always say, a slightly optimistic forecast, yet it is a massive force of adoption and also fragmentation, and adding a lot of complexity to what we're trying to do in IT. And similarly, what we've seen in the last few years, in the last decade, specifically in the consumer space, we find that adoption rates are accelerating. And that has to do with sort of shrinking global networks and sort of the world becoming more homogeneous space, markets growing overall. So if you see here what it took for each of these services, whether it's radio, TV, the first iPod, the internet, Facebook or Twitter, how long they took to actually reach that 50 million user mark in years. We see just as one example here from the consumer space, so how quickly new communication channels get adopted these days. And we see that not only sort of on this channel side, but actually also on very disruptive innovation. So if it took 150 years between the very first phone call to the very first website going live, it only took 16 years afterwards to have both of these things integrated in the iPhone. So we see a convergence, breakthrough technologies, more disruption, and with that, a lot less predictability and a lot more uncertainty and a lot more emergence in IT and in the technology space in general. And when we're looking at the big trends in the future, this is only going to accelerate even further. So we know that it's estimated that the economic impact from the Internet of Things, or from the Internet of Things, is going to be 3 to 6 trillion. Similar space, 3 to 11 for mobile internet and better proliferation, particularly those very well established trends now of leapfrogging things like like broadband for mobile technologies and 4G technologies in emerging economies. And the other big thing that is sort of on the horizon is more and more the automation of knowledge work and more intelligent decision-making and decision-making automation. That's going to be one of the big, at least sort of disruptive trends in the next few years that everybody is looking out for. And why is this now? Why are we talking about speed in IT? And I will come back to that, because we talk about speed in IT and accelerating IT, in particular with one interesting facet to it, because IT is not delivering very well. And since we're talking about the MSc in Major Program Management, I thought I picked one of the big projects from our database. We've studied about 6,000 projects in the last 10 years. And this is probably the worst project that has ever been built under the sun. And so here you can just see the editorial cartoons of all the major Canadian newspapers from 1 week. And it is about the Canadian gun registry. And what happened at the Canadian gun registry was that in 1994, legislation passed the Parliament in Canada on building a gun registry. So all gun holders and all guns in circulation needed to be registered. That was the basic idea. And they went out to a couple of software suppliers and asked for a costing of what would it cost to build an IT solution to do that, to register every license holder and then register all the different guns for these people and persons. And so the cost estimate initially was 190 million that would be needed as investment into capital cost. And luckily for the Canadian taxpayer, that would be offset by 117 million in revenue. It was estimated that the cost was around $20 for a person to get a license and then $5 for every gun to register on the scheme, which ended up that just from basically every gun that was in circulation at that point in time, this thing would almost be free. Taxpayer would only have to pay $2 million towards this project. And of course, brilliant, simple, great policy idea. Let's do this. Let's do something for gun safety. It does cost almost nothing to the taxpayer, passed without much scrutiny and became a law. And then the project started to run into troubles. And you can see here sort of on the left-hand side how the baselines shifted over the time. And the blue one is the cost, and the dashed one is the revenue side from this. And you can see clearly sort of it's going up and up and up. And until it hits that mark there in the year 2000, when both cost and schedule level off. And what happened was that during the final testing of the solution that was already delayed by a year, it became very clear that the IT solution they built was absolutely not fit for purpose. And before the first system even went live, they started developing a replacement solution, the Canadian Firearms Registry number 2. And that project was finally tendered out as a fixed price contract, which is why we don't see the same escalation after the year 2000 that we see before the year 2000. At the same time, you can clearly see that still the costs don't stay constant. And they actually go up, even if you're looking here at non-inflated cost. And also in the year 2000s, they adjusted back the revenue projections for this project, because first the idea was that costs spiraled out of control. We're just going to increase the fees for this scheme, which made the project hugely unpopular, and hence support was wavering for this. At the very end of the project, it is probably the worst project ever been built. So the total project investment cost went up by nearly 600%, of which IT capital investment was about 200%. But what really killed the project was that even the second solution they built didn't achieve the operational benefits and efficiencies that they had hoped for. So instead of processing a gun for £5 or $5 Canadian, per license, and that would be cost effective. The actual transaction cost to do that is about $25 to $30. So there's a massive increase in the processing cost, coupled with a massive delay that required, of course, a lot of manual workarounds, since it was legislated and went into law even before the IT solution was ready, was that sort of by 2006, instead of paying $2 million, Canadian taxpayers almost paid $1,946,000,000 Canadian dollars into this scheme, which is at a cost overrun of 37,000%, or 360 times the initial cost, the worst project ever been built. And if you look around all sorts of different industry and different projects, this is an overview of some of the big sectors in industry from our databases, and you can see here all the different sectors are here sorted by the size of the average cost overrun of a project. And IT is the second worst offender across all the projects that we've looked at. Only the Olympics are worse. So on average, IT projects double their budget. Surprisingly, half of the projects, so 5 out of 10 projects, have cost overrun. Another industry that is even a stronger trend. So, for instance, in rail, we see that 9 out of 10 projects overrun their budget, but not by as much as IT projects. And we also see that the schedule delays are quite considerable, so on average 39%. And in IT, we see that on average, IT projects only realize 3/4 of the benefits that they set out to generate for the people investing, for the organizations investing in them. So there's a benefit shortfall of about 25%. And the last one, I think when we sent out the invite, we attached a couple of different articles to that where you can have a bit of a look on the background. So last category is where we're looking at projects that had very massive cost overruns, so where we see projects actually doing really, really badly, doubling the budget and more. And in IT, that is quite a high rate, and that's very unique for IT projects. And we don't have time to talk about this today, but in IT we actually see that 1 in 6 projects, 18% projects, are incurring massive cost overruns. And if you just look at this, what is the share of projects that have at least 50% or more cost overrun, we see that IT is actually one of the biggest, the most frequent category. 1 in 5 projects have a cost overrun of 50% and more. There are others out there. However, in IT, the average that we then get is the highest of them all. So we basically have a 1 in 5 chance that a project really spirals out of control, more than 50% cost overrun. And if that happens, then the average risk, and that's half of those projects that had these kind of cost overruns, the average is 519%, which is really, as the Canadian registry shows, IT has some of these biggest downside risk and biggest worst case scenarios of all different project types. So, what can we do about this? And one of the interesting questions that we ask us is are we just doing the wrong size of projects? And when we're talking about size, we're always talking about, are we investing too much? Are big projects bad? And what we find here is, so here you can see what was the planned project size on the x-axis in million US dollars, and on the other side it shows us the cost overrun. It's just to pick out one dimension. Schedule looks very similar. And so this is how we measure cost overrun here, is as the actual cost of the project divided by what was initially estimated at the full business case stage. And so a 1.0 is the project delivered on budget, so the actual is the estimate. Above that, obviously, is cost overrun. Below that are cost underruns. And we see, interestingly, that the larger the projects were, there is a slightly negative trend. I mean, it's highly statistically not significant, but there's it's very constant. So we actually see that project size is not a driver of cost risk, which really surprised us when we did the research, because we haven't seen a single organization where the project size isn't the main driver for the governance. So if you're above this certain investment size, you're reporting into this board. If you're above, if you're of a bigger size and you're investing more money, you have to report into these people. So a lot of how we govern the risk of projects is really driven by the consideration of how big and how expensive they are. And if you look at particularly at these kind of outliers, these black swans as we call them, we see that actually larger size is more beneficial or more preferable for projects, because we see that particular small projects have a higher risk of turning into these projects that have 50% or more cost overruns. And larger projects, we see that rate dropping quite dramatically and quite significantly. And if you're asking the questions the other way around, so if you're not looking at projects in terms of size just by the money that is spent on them, but in terms of the speed, how fast they deliver, we see the following picture. So here on the x-axis, instead of budget, now it shows the planned duration of the project. From when the project started to go until the point where the full operational capabilities are delivered of that IT solution. And we see there is a slightly positive trend. So it is about 1 percentage point per year, which doesn't really mean much. It only means that a 5-year project is 4%, 4.4% more, has an average of 4.4% higher cost risk than a 1-year project. So that's almost negligible in practice. However, when we look at the what it does to the black swans, to those ends in the tail, to the projects that overrun massively, like the Canadian gun registry, we see that here is actually a slightly exponential trend that goes up, and where 18% is sort of the average across the whole database that we have, and we looked here at about 4,300 projects. So 18%, that's about the 3-year mark. After that, it's even worse than 1 in 6 projects. So we see 1 in 5 projects ending up with these big cost overruns, and shorter projects being a lot more beneficial to this. So that's now a little conundrum for us, because we know on the one hand side that large costs have sort of a slightly dampening effect. So there's a very slight downward tendency to reduce the risk, or sort of there's actually quite a big tendency to reduce the risk. You remember that big exponential curve going down. When it comes to these outliers, the bigger we get, the better projects are. And at the same time, as the longer we get, the worse projects are performing. And if you put these things together, because they're kind of obviously competing trends, we see this very colorful chart. And I appreciate that might be very difficult to grasp at first, but down there at the bottom, you see the two competing dimensions. One is time and the other one is cost. And the rate of outliers and how often it happens that projects have a cost overrun of 50% or more is on the other axis, the one that goes up vertically. And what this shows, if you just look at the outer corner there, is if you have a very small project, we see that the effect of saying, should we actually scale up a project or scale down a project, is the effect of the time is really the one that drives the overall exposure to risk in IT projects. So what we see from here and how this thing is shaped is it goes up towards the dimension of time dramatically, and then once we, for instance, slice across a certain category of years, so let's say the 4 years where there is that yellow line towards the bottom, so we almost see a very constant, it doesn't really matter how big the project is. So what this tells us is two things. And one is that actually concurrent engineering is not so much of a problem in IT. We can easily scale up, and from this we can see is when it comes to preventing risk and shielding projects against risk, it doesn't matter whether we whether a project is 100 or 200 million dollars big. However, what really matters is how long it takes. So if there's a trade-off to be made to say, we need to invest a lot of money, and therefore can go very, very fast because we're building a very large project organization, we seem to be very able and very equipped to deal with that. However, what we're not really equipped to deal with is very long programs. So saying is we save money to in order to save money, we're doing a project that is stretched out in the timeline, for instance, because we don't have to take on so many resources. We can do a lot of project work with internal resources instead of hiring expensive consultants. here's sort of the clear view about when it comes to de-risking project and what might actually happen in terms of what we're actually going to pay for it, not only what we plan to pay for it, but what we're actually going to pay for it. That might turn out to be a lot lower if you're willing to invest first and then run very, very fast, as opposed to the other way around. One of the big enablers that everybody's talking about at the moment is Agile. Agile is the latest and the greatest in terms of speeding things up. And as part of this big study of IT projects, we of course ask ourselves, is Agile something that should be considered when we're talking about mega projects and major programs and large-scale projects? Because we know that the sweet spot of Agile technologies is really when we're talking about a medium-sized system that is actually not business critical to the operations of the company or the organization, that ideally is a greenfield approach, not a brownfield approach, so it doesn't have to deal with all the legacy and all these ugly interfaces and forgotten lines of code, and has a very stable architecture. So it's working in a very well-defined boundary conditions, how it's going to interface with the rest of the IT landscape. And then in terms of the project, so that's where this project sits, but in terms of the project characteristic itself, Agile, at least in the very idea, should be perfectly suited to deal with projects that are faced with a lot of scope and requirements volatility, so that they see a high rate of changes, whether it's internal because the users can't make up their mind, or because it's external because the technology is moving very fast in that particular sector. Secondly, the project should be mostly done in-house, so there should be very few external resources brought into the project. Those resources that are there should all be co-located, all in the same, ideally in the same room, and there should be very simple governance rules because a lot of authority needs to be delegated to the very front line of coding. So, as you can clearly see, if this is sort of the sweet spot of Agile, that's what the world should look like for which Agile was developed and invented. So one of the big questions we had was now, does it scale? If we look into projects that have been done in this Agile way of the scrums and the 2 weeks and iterations and very fast running and basically the continuous production of functionality, does that scale? Can we see this at sort of the size of projects that we are looking at? And if we break it out for some of those projects in our database, for some very large projects, we looked into what was the delivery methodology. And here sort of on the left-hand side, you see all these different approaches to this. Was the functionality released as a big bang, or was the project broken down into 2, 3 big chunks? So do we have the typical phases and releases? Sort of in the bottom half, it starts to shift the thinking from those kind of big chunks or everything in one go to more time-critical or time-bound measures. So in the first category where you have multiple releases, so where the project followed a release logic, say functionality was released every quarter or every 6 months, so we have 2 or 3 releases, but they're not timed to when we get there, but they're actually timed to dates. And then at the very end of the spectrum, we have the fully agile projects, the one that do the 2-week sprints that have a continuous release of productivity functionality. So continuous putting things continuously in production. And when we now look into what it does to sort of the cost performance, the cost risk, the schedule risk, the benefits, and also these outliers, these black swans, we actually see only that the numbers that have these green check marks here, those are actually statistically significant. So even though there's a lot of noise in the numbers, we can't see that there is a statistically significant difference in the cost performance. So agile projects, same cost overruns as big bang projects. Where it's different, however, is that schedule risk. So we see that the schedule overruns on average about half of what they are for traditional waterfall projects. And that seems to be, and that's the only big difference. The risk of the black swans is very similar. And for benefits, shortfalls, we actually see there's quite a high shortfall of benefits here on average, but there's so much noise around that. In both categories for the projects that didn't have sort of that time release logic, so the multiple release in the agile projects versus the classic waterfall models, even though there is quite a big gap in between these two numbers, minus 50, minus 46%, is actually not statistically significant. So if you're looking at this large sample of projects, we actually see that, well, on the face value of it, Agile might be a great idea and might be fun to work on these projects. However, if it comes to real hard evidence, we only really find support there that Agile seems to be very good at time boxing. So very good at keeping to schedule, which of course makes it a great enabler to speed up IT projects and therefore to de-risk the project overall. But in its own right, it is better at delivering on time. It's not necessarily to deliver better to budget or better to the planned benefits of projects. So, if we look at I think this is close to my last slide, if you're looking into what are now some of those underlying factors that are really characteristics of very long projects. And this is showing what factors are driving schedule risks, so what factors are actually explaining why we see delays in the IT projects we surveyed. And it's looking into what are the factors that explain very long duration. So in the census, and so if you just take the 2 points or the big point that stands out on the very top there, innovation. I see it is quite a high connection to delays. So it has a very high correlation. With delays occurring in the project, and it is a massive problem for projects that are very long. And that is probably one of our intuitions that actually shows through here in the data, that if we have a very long project, technological cycles are moving on, so there is a lot of need of innovation. And but since we're only looking at correlations here, and that's not the same as a causation, as everybody will tell you and everybody knows, it could also be the other way around. It could also be around that if we actually want to do a highly innovative project, that takes a long time. It has a long schedule risk to this. So thinking about this, and when we want to look at sort of taking some of these insights here, is what can we do to speed up projects? And so one of the things is let's not try to be innovative. So if you need to run very fast, innovation is not the best thing to be doing in the project. Same with, for instance, change management. If you want to run very fast, and if we want to de-risk the schedule, because it's such a high factor for delays. So if you want to de-risk the schedule and want to follow a very ambitious schedule, one of the key functions in our project is how we are managing the changes that happen or brought into the organization on the back of this IT project. So innovation, resistance against the project, which focuses really on sort of how well we are working with our stakeholders and the user community. Agile approaches are a good thing to speed up project. Working effectively with a supplier and suppliers working effectively with clients against their expected time of delivery and their speed too, and their ability to deliver is another key factor. And as I said, sort of the effectiveness of how we're managing the changes out into the organization. Those are really the big factors that on the one hand side drive and ensure that projects take a very long time. So they are delaying the project and they are adding delay to the project. So they're also high risk factors. On the other hand, what is speeding up project if it's well done? So the other side of the coin is really two things here in the top right corner that are of the most important in terms of project characteristics, and one is user involvement. So user involvement is actually great because it speeds up projects, so it dramatically reduces the duration of a project, while at the same time sort of for similarly sized projects, and it is also reducing the risk that there are additional project delays tremendously. And the same with the effectiveness of governance. So if a project has an effective governance, it helps up speeding up things substantially, and it is also reducing the risk of delays. And then sort of on the other one that's in the top corner there, the scope volatility, which is interesting because requirements volatility is not such a thing, but if the scope of the project is highly volatile, that is less volatile, that is a great ability to really speed up the project. So if the scope is very volatile, projects tend to take longer. If scope is fairly stable, then projects can speed up. However, it's not a factor that adds a lot of delay to the project once the project is running. And then sort of in the bottom you see there, this is all about building an effective team, which is sort of the big baseline to this, which is not doing much to actually speeding up or slowing down the project, but it's really there to prevent delays in a positive way. So, to sum up, is really when we're looking at what are the benefits and the risk of speeding up IT or accelerating technology. Speed is so important, not only because speed is, or the world of IT seems to be accelerating, and there's some evidence to the fact that that's actually true, but because IT projects are so risky, speed actually stands out as something that we need to pay attention to when we want to make projects less risky and de-risk projects and being better at delivering to time, to budget, and to benefits of projects. However, it also shows that there is no such a thing as a risk-free IT project or IT project portfolio. There will always be risk in IT, but speed is one of the key elements that can help us reduce those risks. And how to do that? I touched on a couple of points, but when I look at these data, I think 3 points really shine through. And one is that if you want to go fast, you have to go slow in the beginning. So building large project teams to effectively work together, building effective governance structure, aligning stakeholders, working on reducing the organizational resistance to a project, being very clear about the change that the project is going to bring to an organization, requires significant front-end investment. So requires significant investment, requires significant attention and effort before the project even starts. So what we see here is really that sort of what I take away from this is that if you want to go fast, you need to actually do more planning, not less. The second thing is that the key thing to speed up a project, if you're on one, is not the technology. It is about social elements of the project. It's about governance, it's about working with the supplier, it's about working with the user, it's working within the teams. So it's all on the human side, on the softer side of project management that makes or breaks a project, in the sense of risk, but also in the sense of the speed it can achieve. And the last thing is that Agile, while everybody's saying is great at delivering at speed, we're not particularly seeing that when we actually look at the hard data behind it. And we see that Agile is pretty good at time boxing projects, probably deciding at a good cutoff point of projects, so stopping at the 90% completion mark rather than going the last 10%, which would also explain why there seem to be larger benefit shortfall than for waterfall projects. But it is actually not accelerating projects per se, but is helping at least to de-risk schedule on that sense. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening. I think we already see some questions trickling in.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that, Alex. That was really, really insightful, really interesting to see some of the key success factors on large-scale IT projects and some of the research coming out of the school. And I think also it gives an insight into some of the issues that we're looking at during the MSc and major programs, as well as the MPLA program. So we've, as Alex says, we've already got some questions coming in, so we're going to have a chance to just go through those questions in a couple of minutes. So if you do have any questions for Dr. Budzier, it's quite a unique opportunity to interact with him directly and to get an insight from him on some of the key issues that you're facing currently. And also, we'll just go through now over the next couple of slides a bit of information in regards to the MSc and major programs, and I'll talk a little bit around the application process for the program. So my name's Tom Brownrigg. I'm the recruitment manager for the program, and I'm just going to talk through, first of all, what the focus of the program is. So the MSc and major programs is really pitched at senior managers who are leading large-scale, complex and transformational projects and programs. It is delivered over the course of 8 modules. So each of the modules takes place from Tuesday through to Friday, and the program takes place over the course of 2 years. The course culminates as well in a 10,000 word dissertation or final project. So actually this is a really interesting opportunity for you to work with our academic team and actually produce a meaningful piece of research, which normally would be applied to your own organisation or your own kind of consultancy project or work. And quite often candidates use this to leverage support from their employers. And as we said at the outset, really what's very interesting about this program and what we feel here at Oxford Saïd is unique is our focus on major programs. So we're looking at the top tier of major programs and mega projects. This isn't just a normal master's degree on project management. We're really looking at some of the large scale, really complex projects which are taking place globally and having effects both socially, economically and politically across the world. So this slide just shows the typical class profile. So really one of the advantages of this program is its diversity in terms of our class members. So we work very hard to compose the class and take candidates from a variety of different sectors. So we have participants ranging from defence to large-scale infrastructure projects, participants who are working within the public sector, so perhaps the NHS, or working within IT or the financial sector and other private industries. So this really gives participants the opportunity to interact and to draw from the concepts which our academic team introduce and actually discuss them and almost compare experiences and challenges that you've obtained during your work experience. So we're diverse in terms of sectors, but also this slide demonstrates how diverse we are in terms of our typical class makeup. So we have participants coming in from all over the world. And I think really this slide demonstrates how accessible the program is. The modular structure enables participants to come in every couple of months to pick up their concepts and then to go away and apply some of the program material in their day-to-day roles. So your investment. So a bit of information here which you can take away. So the program fee is £36,000 434, and that includes matriculation, tuition, lunch and some refreshments as well as college dinners. So we offer the opportunity for you to become a member of one of our colleges and to actually get a feel for the University of Oxford, not just Saïd Business School. In terms of time commitment, so the program is a significant commitment, so you would have to complete 8 modules over the course of 2 years. Each module has its own pre-reading to do as well as an assignment which has to be submitted, and the program, as I mentioned before, culminates in the 10,000 word final project. We, as a normal guideline, would recommend that you spend about 10 hours study per week when you're not here in Oxford. So again, that gives you an insight into what the commitment is. Admissions requirements. So I think really important at the beginning of this slide is just to underline that we look at all candidates on a case-by-case basis. So really these admissions requirements are just a guideline, but they should give you a good idea of what we're looking for in our typical candidates. So a good undergraduate degree or equivalent professional qualification, a minimum of 7 years relevant professional experience. So we'd really ideally be looking for candidates to have had some kind of exposure to major programs or large-scale projects. Then, and I mean the 7 years relevant professional experience is a minimum requirement, but I would say typically I think participants normally have
10 years,
10, 15 years experience. So that really gives you an insight. I think the average age on the program is around about 40. So it gives you an insight into the level of experience of our participants. We do require an English test if English is not your native language. So we would normally require an IELTS or TOEFL test, but we do offer the opportunity to some candidates who use English regularly in their professional roles to apply for an English waiver. So if you're interested in that option, then please do let us know and we can talk you through that process. Finally, really important, another of our kind of measures and incentives to keep increasing diversity on our program is we have 2 50% women's scholarships for the MPM program this year. So they will be worth up to 50% of the tuition fee. Please bear in mind that you would need to have applied for the program by the 20th of June to qualify for that scholarship. And just a couple of points on what you would need to submit. I mean, we would encourage you to get in touch with the recruitment team if you were looking to apply, and we can walk you through the application process and give you an idea of whether we think you would be worth registering an application. But you'd be required to submit an up-to-date CV, 2 references from 2 professional referees who can really talk through your experience, your strengths and weaknesses, and potentially your suitability for the program. Transcripts from your previous higher education qualifications, and you would be required to complete 3 pieces of written work, written assignments. If you were successful at that stage, then you would be called to an interview with our admissions committee, which is most of the time conducted via Skype. Okay. Brilliant. Well, we now have some time for questions, and I can see that we've already got a fantastic number of questions that have been sent in. So we'll try and work through these, guys. We've got about 10-15 minutes. So, Alex, we've got a comment here. How fast is too fast? Having seen projects' resources falling apart due to unrealistic speed, more planning to go fast obviously takes more time. So I think that's a statement, Alex. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's a very interesting question, and how fast is too fast? Because one of the things and how you can ensure that a project has a delay is by setting a very unrealistic timeline. So if you're setting a completely unrealistic timeline in the beginning of saying, well, we're going to do a project faster than anybody has ever done before, that is a lot of pain. That's a lot of pain for the project. So, and obviously, what I meant here with go fast or go slow to go fast, that's sort of probably the second part of the question, is that split between what you spent in the front end. So what do you spend in planning before you actually start building up a project team, before you start going into project execution and all the work on the project. So what you spend with a small team before you go large, and that really is important to identify when you can go fast or sort of going fast afterwards. And so that's the slow element of this. The front end can't be compressed. You can't you can't just cut corners in the planning process and say, well, we need to be extremely fast, so just let's skip planning through this project in detail and let's just get going, because otherwise, we will be already jeopardizing our schedule. So to go fast at size requires careful planning, and that's sort of the point, and that's often a point where a lot of projects make the mistake of skipping that step, and particularly in IT, when we compare this to other industries, for instance, civil engineering at large, we see that design requirements, investigations that are made before the project even starts are at a much, much lower level. Often projects are started without any clear indication of what it's supposed to be doing and why it is for. Whereas in civil engineering, for instance, we see that on large projects you have at least 10% design maturity, so 10% of the detailed design is done when the project starts in earnest. And that is in IT a completely different thing. So hence, question, of course, is can there be anything as it is too fast? And obviously, we can't talk about that now in too much detail, but one of the things I encourage everybody always to do is to at least look around us and sort of just ask the question is, and what happened to the last 20 projects that try to do the same? How fast were they? And can we maybe be better than average? We probably won't be the fastest project ever being built, but let's try to be a little faster than the projects before, or the previous project, and sort of improve on that without sort of this being too aspirational, because then you end up easily on the other side. If you're setting completely unrealistic and unfeasible schedule targets, you're delayed from basically the start of the project.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex. We've got another question here asking about the slides. So where did the sample for IT projects come from? Private sector or government sector, or was it a mixture? From my own experience, private sector projects have tended to be controlled more strictly and more complete in terms of budget. So the kind of comparison between private
and public sector, yes. The sample is about 50-50 split between public and private sector. And actually, when we look at this, as in, I'm very sorry to say that, but your experience is not really reflected in the data because we don't really see a difference between the public and the private sector. Unless there is a change element to the project, then we actually see that the public sector, the public sector is struggling a little more with those type of projects if there's heavy change associated with it. But apart from that, we could not find a systematic difference between public sector bad, private sector good, or the other way around.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so there's just a quick question. Can we get a copy of these slides? So first of all, yes, what we're planning on doing is sending out a recording of this session, which we will send out to all registrants. So you'll get a copy of this, which you can reference as well. So a message here, Dr. Budzier, first of all, thank you very much for the session. What is the best way to manage changes to the scope of the project? In my last project, changes to the scope caused a major delay.
Actually, when we look across all the projects that we looked at, the reason for cost overrun and schedule delay is, 80% of those are driven by scope changes. So it is a very frequent occurrence. Almost every single project has scope changes. And they always, and when it goes wrong, there are always a major explanation for this. And so the problem is not so much as that scope changes, you can't prevent them. That's the key thing. And a lot of the project management processes that were put in place, particularly sort of the, we said earlier, this course is not about project management and these kind of best practice frameworks that you get from sort of typical certification courses. But what we really want to look at very critically together with our students and participants in these courses is where are the challenges? And some of the big challenges is that scope change happens so regularly that we need to deal with it. And the biggest problem, and that's when they hurt and cause delays and cost overruns, when they contribute to that, is really when we start projects and build project organizations pretending that's not the case. So if you build a project and make a project plan and build a project organization, and it can only be successful if there's not a single scope change, then it is going to fail almost with a high degree of certainty. And so hence, and that's what we're doing, is looking into what can we do on the organizational design. So how do we need to adapt our processes to a bit more flexible? How do we adapt into our structures? How can we create incentive and schemes and commercial arrangements to account for that flexibility? So how can we actually be truthful and honest about this? Because we know scope change is going to happen. How can we plan how big those scope changes are going to be? What cost implications they're going to have, what time implications they're going to have. Now can we sort of make our organizations, the whole project as a system more flexible, but also how can we better plan for the risks that are associated with these?
And I guess that fits in with the concept of going slow before going fast. So yeah. How you can build that into your plan. Okay, so the next question is, I like the metric of social complexity, especially in engineering data-driven programs. I find if it often is an underestimated factor, maybe because it's so hard to measure. can you give some insights into what drives social complexity and how to tackle it?
Yeah. So in our systems engineering module, we're particularly looking into complexity and complexity management. And because everybody's always saying, well, this is a very complex project, but nobody really knows what that means. And if you find two complex projects, nobody really knows what the difference is and who should win, who's more complex. But when we look at it and unpack it, there are some sources of complexity, let's put it that way. And three key sources are there. And one is that we're dealing with a project that's just very big or very fast. So stuff that we talked about is either a lot of engineers, a lot of programmers on site, a lot of employees part of the project, and it's going very fast. And that is a complexity, that's more the traditional understanding of complexity. That's very much the engineering, hard, data-driven mindset you mentioned. And we've got a lot of good tools to do that, good scheduling tools, good programming tools. We know how to do that because it is very easy to manage that with command and control and monitoring and control structures. And we have a lot of transactional tools to deal with that. But there's two other sources of complexities that are really difficult to deal with. And those are more the social side. And one is having to do with a lot of uncertainty and change in the project. And that often means that when we start the project, we don't really know how this is going to deliver the outputs and the outcomes that are planned for the project. So how are we going to get to the benefits? Either because it requires active user involvement and co-creation of the value of the project, or because the world is changing rapidly, or because we actually don't know what we want to do and there's more of an exploration or an expedition rather than a simple journey from A to B. And the last big source of complexity, of course, is politics. So not only in the public sector and private sector, almost at equal scale, there's politicking going on around every major project. So identifying really this and all these three different kind of complexities, whether it's structural, whether it's that emergence, uncertainty nature, so strategic complexity, or it is that kind of political, this power, politics, people kind of complexity. All these always feature in every single project, but typically one is really dominant, is really causing the difficulties of managing this project successfully. But first of all, understanding is where does my project sit? What am I doing about this? Because these three kind of sources of complexity require very different interventions, very different responses to deal with. And when we run through this, and as I said, in the systems engineering module, we workshop this through in great detail, we actually find that every single time we do this, that once you nitpick at it and really unpack it and really think critically through your project and what you can do about it, about 80% of the complexities can be reduced. And as you rightly said, if this is a very technical engineering-driven background, it requires a big shift in mindset to really think about this. And we actually need to think about the project as a social problem, not as a technical problem. And the same thing goes for in planning. This is a massive challenge to say, we can easily put in an additional contingency or additional cost buffer if we know there's going to be a massive technological upgrade because the project is 5 years long. We know that technology cycles are 2 years. So we know there's going to be a new generation of technology before we go live with the project. At the same time, we know that the average CEO and CIO stay in their job for 3 years. But how can we put that into our plans and into budgeting? That we're not only going to have a technological revolution, we're also going to have a management revolution during the course of the project. And that is really difficult. And so in the risk management module, we're going to talk a little bit about what can we do in terms of better planning and more accurate planning for these kind of events. And so we get better, more realistic cost estimates for those kind of problems that are really, really difficult to solve if your dominant viewpoint is often a very technical one or is really informed by your technical expertise and by your technical background.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've just got about 5 more minutes for questions. So we've got quite a few here. So we'll try and get to all of them. So the next question, you said concurrent engineering may not help for IT. Go slow to go fast seems based on set-based concurrent engineering. How can we go slow to go fast?
Oh, quite. No, sorry, that's not what I meant. I tried to say, at least. I don't know what I really said. I will listen back to my own recording to find out, I guess. is that concurrent engineering is the way forward. So what we see, it doesn't really matter if you compare two projects, say 2-year projects that cost 500 million and a 5-year project that costs only 200 million. It's trying to do the same, but one we do with more internal resources, the other one with a big bought-in resource base that all work concurrently. The risk associated to the shorter and more expensive program are a lot lower than the one if we stretch it out over time. So what we see from now, sort of my take on how I interpret the data, is really that concurrent engineering is not the problem, but timelines are the problem. So yes, just as a clarification about this.
Okay, perfect. So one quick question: 3 pieces of written work. What's your expectation, please? I mean, we have one larger essay, which is around 2,000 words, and then we have 2 shorter 500-word assignments. I mean, what I would say, I won't go into depth now, but if you are thinking that potentially you could be a suitable candidate for the program and you'd like to hear more, I'm going to leave our contact details, so please do get in touch and we can actually talk through what the assignments entail as part of the application. And I think we've just got time for one last question for Dr. Budzier. So if anyone not directly from project and program management background but has 8 years experience in IT and wants to enroll in the MSc in program management, do you allow in the program? So actually, I think that's a question for me. So in terms of the eligibility, I think we'd encourage you to upload your CV. So send through your CV to us. You can do that on the website. We can take a look and we'll actually respond to all of our CV reviews, and if we think it's worthwhile, then we'll definitely set up a phone call and just go through your experience. So I would say it's definitely worth, we'd like to know more. Normally our candidates have significant exposure to major programs, but we are willing to consider individual cases. So we do have time for one last question for Dr. Budzier, and it's just a simple request. Please give some light on project timelines.
And somebody else also asked what's the correlation between project time and size. And I guess since it's both asking about very similar things. From the project that we looked at, on average, those were about 3 years long, so they're quite long projects. But we've seen, to really study the effect of size and speed, we looked at everything from very small to very large. So typically, the lower cutoff, basically ran around hundreds of organizations and asked them to show me their data on their projects. And so typically at lower end, what is labeled a project is something that is as fast as a couple of months, to the projects that take 20, 25 years, although we now know that's a very bad idea to do that. And surprisingly, there is very little correlation, and that's something very unusual in IT. It's almost, when it comes to picking what's the scope we want to do, what's the timeline in which we can achieve that, and what should be the budget, it is a lot of trade-offs can be made very freely between these 3 core constraints and 3 objectives of projects. So there's very, very little correlation between that. And that's very, very different, for instance, when you compare this to other engineering disciplines like civil engineering, where sort of the size of an asset, so for instance, when we look at dams, it's very clear that pretty much for every 10 meters of dam wall height, you have to almost add 12 months of schedule. So there's a much, much stronger link between size and time of projects. Versus in IT, there's a lot more degrees of freedom, which is also why it is a lot easier actually to speed them up. With a bit of careful planning and thinking through this and being innovative in how we're going to deliver the project, because we don't have as many constraints from sort of laws of physics really that we would need to overcome in order to achieve what we want to do.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So I am going to just leave our contact details. So these are the contact details for our recruitment team. So if you're perhaps considering the MSc in major programs and you think that you may be a suitable candidate for this and you'd like to hear more about the program, then please do get in touch and we'd be happy to talk you through the process. I'd like to thank you all for your engagement with the webinar and for attending, and the questions that you've sent in have been really, really interesting, and I think it's been a very insightful session. And finally, a massive thank you to Dr. Budzier for doing this presentation. I think it's been really, really interesting and hopefully has provided a good insight into the program.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, well, thank you very much, guys, and we'll hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.
Bye.